are coming on the air right as President Biden is getting off the stage, telling Americans we are at a turning point, right? That Congress has to pass new laws to protect our right to vote. Okay, but how? Because you need every Democrat to be on board to change the rules to get this done. And right now they're not, even though the president just made a new push for that rules change today. We're live in Atlanta, where some activists actually boycotted the speech altogether, saying it's just not enough. You're going to hear from one of them I talked to coming up. And in Washington today, lawmakers have tons of questions for America's top doctors. So we'll show you what happens when Dr. Anthony Fauci goes toe-to-toe with Republican Senator Rand Paul again, and what he's doing now in just the last couple minutes. And look, I love a party as much as the next person, but maybe lockdown 2020 wasn't the best time for that? Don't tell that to Boris Johnson, with the UK Prime Minister under fire again for pictures from last year, showing him breaking his own rules. We'll talk about how the public's reacting in London, just as we're getting scary news about Europe's Omicron fight. Plus, some concrete steps from the Justice Department to try and stop another January 6th. Why they say domestic terrorism is the biggest threat to the country right now. And here's a sentence I never thought I'd say. A pig heart is now beating inside the chest of a human man. Yeah, sounds like sci-fi, but it's happening right now over in Maryland. We're going to tell you all about this incredible medical breakthrough and what it means for the future of transplants. Hey, I'm Hallie, and in just the last few minutes, you heard from President Biden about what he thinks is at stake here, right? The fundamental right for all of us to be able to cast a ballot. And this is no hyperbole, the foundation of our democracy. With President Biden, right as we were coming on the air, calling this a battle for the soul of America.
I believe that the threat to our democracy is so grave that we must find a way to pass these voting rights bills. Debate them, vote, let the majority prevail. And if that bare minimum is blocked, we have no option but to change the Senate rules, including getting rid of the filibuster for this.
The filibuster, that's that rules change we're going to talk about in a second. But first, look at this map. This shows why he's pushing Congress to do something now. Because states, they're not waiting around. The green states, you see, they're the ones expanding ballot access. The red states are the states restricting it. And some of them with slash marks, they're actually doing both. We've got to point out Democrats have proposals on the table, two right here, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So those would expand voter registration, boost mail-in voting, protect elections officials, among other things. But Republicans are not interested, and they're united in being not interested in that. Problem is, as it's been for most of the president's agenda, Senate rules say you need 60 votes for bills like these. Republicans have 50, Democrats have 50. And as we just heard, the president now wants to change the rules to 50 votes just for this issue. And it's up to Democrats in Congress to make that happen. But in order to do so, Democrats have to be united, and they're not. The two you see on your screen, Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, they're still talking about ways to avoid the so-called nuclear option, which would let Democrats pass those bills without Republicans. Okay, this is a lot of talking, right? We've been talking about a lot of the talking that's been happening. Here's who's sick of the talking: voting rights activists. Some of them didn't even show up today to hear the president speak because they want more than just words. They want real movement. I talked with one of those advocates, Cliff Albright, who says the president should have come to Georgia with an announcement, not just remarks. Watch.
We thought that there was more that he could do there that would be really focused on actions, really focused on coming up on a compromise. If he was going to come to Georgia, one thing that would be worth him coming, if it wasn't so much a speech, but an announcement saying, hey, I've worked it out with my good friend Joe Manchin. We've got a deal on modifying the filibuster.
We're going to talk with Garrett Haake about what Senator Manchin's thinking in just a sec. But let's start with Mike Memoli, who is in Atlanta, where the president just wrapped up. So, Mem, one of the things here we have to know, this was a long day. This was a long afternoon for the president in this area. And it was full of optics, right? He visited the crypt of MLK. He visited with the King family. He went to the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church there. He delivered this speech, right? But there are his supporters, and voting rights advocates who say this has to be about more than optics ultimately.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. And I thought back as I was listening to the president today to the way he announced his presidential campaign, almost 3 years ago now, 2019. And there was originally a plan from the Biden campaign to announce with sort of a gauzy video of him on the stoop of his old home in Scranton talking about his roots. And they scrapped that. And what did we get instead? We got that video in which he described the scene we saw in Charlottesville, and he talked about this battle for the soul of America. There was a decision then made in the Biden campaign that the way he was going to be the nominee in a very crowded Democratic field was to raise the stakes of the election. I was reminded of it because that's what we saw the president do today. You know, because of the conversations that we have off the air among our colleagues, the biggest question I've been asking the White House is, what is this going to accomplish when everyone knows the math in the Senate is where it is, that it's unlikely to move the votes to get rules changes to get these legislations passed? And I think the answer was to raise the stakes. You saw the president in as stark terms as I have ever heard him about this issue specifically, really call Republicans out, talk about this as a fundamental choice, including a lot of Republicans that he served with. Are you going to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis? Are you going to be on the side of Martin Luther King or Bull Connor? That's a really profound, stark choice. And I think that's why this is not necessarily a speech about winning this vote on the floor this week, trying to change the rules, but really marking a moment in time. That's what the president said. This is a defining issue, and the president clearly wants to be on the right side of history, and he hopes that this speech is the beginning of a process that might move the needle for the rest of his party and maybe even some Republicans too.
Mike, can I just say, the patriotic soundtrack playing behind you, it is giving me major like Hollywood movie vibes for you right now. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot happening with this live shot as you're the last man standing there because the president's speech is wrapped up. Everybody skedaddles. One of the things that I think is so interesting is a statistic that I know, and I say this with love, I know you're obsessed with the stat, which is the number of speeches that President Biden has given about, let's say, COVID, right, versus the number of speeches he's given about Build Back Better, his infrastructure plan. 61 times he's delivered speeches in his presidency on COVID. 39 times for Build Back Better. This is just the second speech he's ever given, right? A keynote speech on voting rights here. That is partly why I showed this statistic earlier today. I'm like, that's partly why some voting rights advocates are like, that's not okay. We do not appreciate that. That's why we're not showing up. And that, by the way, included Stacey Abrams, who's been a huge grassroots player, mobilizing the grassroots in Georgia.
I love this stat. I love a good Excel spreadsheet. I love a good sort of data exercise to try to make the point.
Nerd friend. Yes, it's important, right?
which is clear. I mean, as the president has often quoted his father, show me your budget and I'll show you what you value. Show me your schedule and I'll tell you what you value. And that's exactly what a lot of the president's critics have been saying, is he clearly doesn't value this issue because he hasn't devoted anywhere near the kind of presidential oxygen to this issue that they think is justified. But I think there's another, I was reminded as well as I watched the speech of something a White House official told me a few months ago about this fight over rules changes, which is the president really, as somebody who served on the Judiciary Committee, helped pass, as he laid out in this speech, the Voting Rights Act multiple times, reauthorizations with Republican support, unanimous often on the floor. He thinks Democrats have picked the wrong fight. And by making it about rules changes, you're letting Republicans off the hook. So that's why the president tried to use this speech to not make it, yes, he talked about rules changes and endorsed them, but he tried to really make this about Republicans, making this, and by extension, Joe Manchin, because he knows that Joe Manchin is listening to Republicans. And so that's really the power of the moment, is what the White House really thinks is to play here. Now, it was only 2, but the White House is telegraphing that there's going to be more speeches like this down the road. We know it's an election year, and the vote itself is an election issue, and so the president's going to be speaking more about it, according to what White House officials are telling us now.
Mem, thank you so much. You can go home now. I appreciate you holding it down there in Atlanta. Thank you, friend. Let me go to Garrett Haake, who is already closer to home, at least here in D.C. So, Garrett, we're talking about Senator Manchin, right? He talked, as he has done quite often, over the last year that President Biden's been in office, about how he feels about this whole rules change thing. I want to play that.
Filibuster is what we have, our rules. We need some good rule changes to make the place work better, but getting rid of the filibuster doesn't make it work better.
All right, I told my team we would not actually say the F word on the air, the word filibuster. We're going to have to, right, because Senator Manchin's talking about it. That's that rules change again. You got to have this, as they say in D.C., Garrett's getting the weeds, you got to change the filibuster, that's that rule, right, in order to get this voting rights stuff done like Democrats want to. But Garrett, if there is anything Senator Joe Manchin is, it is consistent on this issue, right? He doesn't want to change it, and he's made that pretty clear. So what's different now?
Well, nothing, and that's the problem for Democrats. I mean, Manchin has voted twice in the last couple of years against making rule changes. He's the only senator currently in this body that's voted against both the most recent sets of rule changes to lower the threshold from 60 to 50 votes, first for lower-level presidential appointees, then for Supreme Court justices. He doesn't want to do it here. If there's 2 things we know about Joe Manchin, he likes doing stuff in a bipartisan way, and he likes talking to folks. So the rule changes that he has proposed are ones that would allow more discussion, like getting rid of the first 60-vote threshold to start debate on a bill, but not the one at the end to actually pass it. And he says any other rule changes should be bipartisan. Neither of those things moves this voting rights package anywhere closer to becoming law.
So I think it's also important to note the context here that sometimes this whole filibuster rules change discussion, it's kind of an arms race, right? If you look at the history of it here, you had in 2013, the late Harry Reid, who's going to be remembered on the Hill actually tomorrow, used this to push through some lower court nominees. Then you had Mitch McConnell, who came out later and said, OK, we're going to do it for Supreme Court justices. So now Democrats are saying, OK, we're going to do this carve out, or we're going to try to for voting rights. Republicans are threatening to do the same thing again, right, and to escalate here again. Could that backfire on Democrats?
That is Kirsten Sinema's argument for why she doesn't support this rule change. You could call it the give a mouse a cookie argument. That's the way I think about it. Every additional piece you give on the filibuster on these rule changes provides the next Senate, with a new majority and a different party, a desire to move even further and changing the rules even more. Manchin's used a different metaphor. He says, you talk about carve-outs. When you carve a turkey, usually you end up eating all of it eventually. And so that is exactly the argument that Republicans are making. They're also making the argument that if the Senate goes down this road of changing the rules, they won't make it easier to get stuff done. They'll use every other procedural tool in their kit to make it even harder. This is what Mitch McConnell had to say about it today.
It's appropriate to ask, how easy would it be to get consent to turn the lights on? How easy would it be to have the traditional majority function of determining the agenda?
We talk about this sometimes. People think that the Senate is dysfunctional now. There is a ton that happens in that body that is done by simple consent. Everybody just agrees, sometimes almost without a vote, to move on to issue X, Y, or Z. Republicans are saying, you think it's bad now. We can make it a whole lot worse if you go down this road.
Of course, Democrats' rejoinder is this is so important, right? This is so critical to democracy that we've got to do it. We're going to talk about that piece of it, Garrett, with our friend and colleague Blaine Alexander, who is back from her maternity leave later on in the show. Garrett, hey, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it, pal.
You bet.
Elsewhere on the Hill, you saw Dr. Anthony Fauci and CDC Director Rochelle Walensky. Listen, this got personal. This got tense. This got really heated as they were taking questions from senators about the administration's response to the Omicron surge here. Republicans really going after them about whether or not the American public has lost faith in them. And it got really intense when you heard from Republican Senator Rand Paul, who again went after Dr. Fauci for seeming to disagree with scientists, this whole issue of where COVID originated. This has been something Senator Paul has been talking about for months. It's been something Dr. Fauci's been dismissing for months. Watch.
What happens when he gets out and accuses me of things that are completely untrue is that all of a sudden that kindles the crazies out there, and I have threats upon my life, harassment of my family, and my children with obscene phone calls because people are lying about me.
The timing of this is really important because it comes as COVID cases hit an all-time high in the last 24 hours. At least 1.4 million new cases, gang, just in the last day, right? That is a lot. Hospitalizations are setting records, too. About 141,000 people in the U.S. are currently in the hospital with COVID, too. It's gotten so bad that some spots in New York, some hospitals have actually stopped elective procedures altogether. So this is the backdrop, right, happening in the country. Hospitals overrun, hospitalizations up. This is the backdrop to what we saw on the Hill. Hallie Vitale has been watching what we're seeing on the Hill. And Hallie, what is so interesting here, and I think a key part of the story today as it relates to COVID, is the way that this is getting personal and acrimonious and politicized as we've seen this entire pandemic. And today put that in such stark relief with Dr. Fauci and Walensky on Capitol Hill facing these really tough questions from Republicans and defending the administration's response and defending the science here. At one point, Hallie, I don't have to tell you, we had this off-mic moment where Dr. Fauci seemed to call one senator a moron, right? That senator's already got a statement out, talking about it. But what's interesting, this is not altogether new. 60 seconds of a trip down memory lane of Dr. Fauci and Rand Paul and the way that this has been in the pandemic. Watch.
So let me finish. You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans. Right. You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about.
If he's going to be dishonest, he ought to be challenged.
Senator Paul, we will allow Dr. Fauci to respond after you've given accusations like that. Dr. Fauci.
Well, I don't have any more to say except to say that, as usual, and I have a great deal of respect for this body of the Senate, and it makes me very uncomfortable to have to say something, but he is egregiously incorrect in what he says. If you look at the email
that you responded to and hurried up and said, I can do it. We got something in Wired magazine.
No. I think in usual fashion, Senator, you are distorting everything about me.
Hallie Vitale. I talked with one doctor today who said she actually so appreciated that Dr. Fauci stood up to Senator Paul today, not just for himself, but for other public health experts who are trying to get the truth out there.
Yeah, Hallie, I was with you during that live shot, and that is the sentiment of other public health officials who I've spoken to as well. Fauci here coming for the literal overlap of science and politics. Public health officials, including Anthony Fauci, coming to the Hill today. And you look at those clips there of Rand Paul and Anthony Fauci, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I feel like that was also sort of the tone and tenor of this hearing overall. We did hear some new things, some new specifics, but for the most part, it was a reiteration of things that we already knew. I think the other piece of this, though, when you look at old videos like that and you put them in the context of today, there's an incentive structure among conservatives and some Republicans to continue demonizing Fauci and to continue casting doubt and spreading misinformation about this pandemic. Just before I got on the air with you, I got a fundraising email from no one other than Senator Rand Paul. This is part of that financial incentive structure, and it's part of bolstering your conservative credentials with some voters on the right, something that the former president started and something that several people here in Congress are now clearly continuing.
We also, as we talk about what I think you described so accurately, Hallie, as the overlap of science and politics, look at what Bernie Sanders is doing, right? With the senator today tweeting that all Americans should have face masks that will keep them safe. He says he's introducing a bill tomorrow for N95s to be sent to every household in the country. This is super interesting, Hallie, because as you know, this comes at a time when there's a lot of questions around, cloth masks, maybe evidentially, according to the evidence out there, I just made up that word, whatever, may not be the best. N95s are good. Senator Sanders is saying, let's send them, but the White House hasn't officially changed the guidance, right, coming from the government about what kind of masks we should be wearing.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of questions. And we heard some of those specific questions get asked during the hearing. Some senators saying, hey, can I get some specificity if you're a teacher and you're vaccinated and you test positive? How long do you have to quarantine for? As someone myself who recently got over having COVID, those changing guidelines are continuously shifting. A lot of Americans have these questions. So we did hear some of those specifics in this hearing today. But it's also, when you talk to people here on the Hill, where I spend most of my time, there's an attempt to make a delineation between what the administration is doing and some of the confusing and messy guidance coming out of people like the CDC. But for most Americans, they are not making a differentiation between the CDC and the Biden administration. It is all part and parcel. It is all part of the group of people who are trying to get us out of this pandemic. So there were some clarifications there, but I was actually surprised when you talk about masks, specifically the difference between N95 or KN95. There wasn't a lot of talk about that today. There was a little bit of talk about producing these masks, making sure they're available, but not in terms of which is better and more efficient for Americans to be wearing.
Something that people definitely want to know about. We'll see what else comes out of that tomorrow when the senator brings that forward, that bill. Hallie Vitale, thank you, I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Just in tonight, the House January 6th committee has now sent subpoenas to 3 people involved in planning that rally at the Ellipse that day. Longtime advisor to Donald Trump Jr., Andy Sarabian, right-wing strategist Arthur Schwartz, and Ross Worthington, who allegedly drafted former President Trump's remarks that day. We also learned who else is on the list of people that committee wants to talk to. This may not come as a surprise to you. Rudy Giuliani, the former attorney for the former president. The committee chair, Benny Thompson, told reporters just this afternoon they do want to talk to Mr. Giuliani at some point, saying he's an integral part of whatever happens and not ruling out a subpoena. So in just the last hour, we learned Chicago's mayor, Lori Lightfoot, has tested positive for COVID. She tweeted she's feeling some cold-like symptoms, but other than that, she's fine. It all comes after she told teachers and students to get back to school tomorrow. You know how we've been talking about that standoff in Chicago between the city and the teachers union? It kept kids totally out of school for 5 days. That stalemate is now over, right? That's because there's new rules now for when a classroom or school needs to go virtual. Teachers and students are going to get KN95 masks. Speaking of masks, the district is expanding testing, and they're bringing back some daily COVID screening, too. In Los Angeles, you had kids going back today there. Things were a lot different. There wasn't this huge fight over returning, but students, teachers, all the staff had to test negative before going back to school. Of course, you saw some anxiety, some frustration from teachers and parents about whether even that is enough to keep everybody safe. I want to bring in Aaron McLaughlin, who's out in North Hollywood for us tonight. And this is interesting, Aaron. We looked at what happened in Chicago, third biggest school district. You're in LA, second biggest school district in the country. Officials there really determined to reopen today, even with COVID rates the highest they've ever been among staff and students, 10 times what it was before the holiday, right? What are you hearing? Talk about the steps in order to get this return to school work there.
Well, what we saw in the days leading up to the start of the spring semester, which should mention it was delayed by only a day, Hallie, was just this mad, all hands on deck effort to get these tests and to get some 600,000 students within the LA Unified School District tested with antigen tests. They were distributing the tests at schools like the one you see behind me, also at other points throughout Los Angeles. Not only students had to be tested, but teachers and staff as well. They say they managed for the most part to pull it off, but the results of that testing disturbing to some experts really concerned about the amount of COVID currently in the community here in LA and questioning whether this is the right move for the LA Unified School District to make, Hallie.
Okay, so that's what we're hearing from experts. What about from teachers, from parents, the people you're talking to?
Yeah, well, teachers and parents alike, they're extraordinarily concerned about this situation, really caught off guard by the exponential rise of the Omicron virus. Keep in mind that those test results showed a positivity rate of some 15% for students, over 16% for teachers. Those are numbers that people here in Los Angeles really haven't seen up until this point. And last year, they shut down in the face of the possibility of those numbers. This year, they're pushing forward. I was speaking to one parent dropping off her kids this morning, and she said that she was worried about the testing procedures, pointing out that just because some of these kids tested negative some 3 or 4 days ago doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be beginning school today COVID negative. Take a listen to what she had to say.
Well, because a lot of the kids were tested, but that was like 3-4 days ago. And from personal experience, I know people who have caught it, and it seems like the incubation is about that. So a lot of them who tested negative are probably going to come back positive. And so I'm nervous for my kids to be around that.
Teachers that I've been speaking to also echoing those concerns. We spoke to one high school teacher this morning. She got her negative COVID antigen test. She woke up this morning feeling symptomatic. She was too worried about those symptoms. She said it wasn't safe. She was going to go back and get another COVID test. She called in sick. That just gives you an idea of the anxiety and the nervousness, the uncertainty surrounding the start of the spring semester here in Los Angeles, and the possibility that things could be in flux going forward.
Yeah. Aaron McLaughlin, thank you so much for that reporting for us out there in LA. Good to see you. So listen to this. The number of FBI investigations into suspected domestic terrorism have more than doubled since the spring of 2020. That's according to national security officials, who also today announced what they're going to do about it. This all happened at a Senate committee hearing with Matthew Olson, the head of the Justice Department's security division. He announced that the DOJ is launching a unit dedicated specifically to domestic terror in the U.S. This is like DOJ Special Unit Division, right? His team says there's this persistent threat, this evolving threat of domestic terrorism, and that the greatest threat comes from lone actors who get radicalized online. And let's not forget the timing of all this, right? The new division comes just days after the anniversary of January 6th, which is now one of the department's biggest criminal investigations ever. Pete Williams is joining us now. And Pete, I'm so glad we have you here because, listen, we've heard from FBI Director Chris Wray before that, yes, domestic terrorism is our biggest threat. This is getting more specific, and it's putting some numbers behind this and some action plans behind this, right? Talk us through the plan.
Well, what they say the biggest threat is not only domestic terrorism, but they break it down a little bit and say within that, the largest increase in these offenses is people who are either motivated by racial or ethnic hatred or anti-government sentiment. That's where the big growth has been. So they want to have a unit of lawyers inside the National Security Division who will focus just on domestic terrorism to make sure that investigations around the country are aware of trends, that they are aware of legal developments that they might otherwise miss if they were in isolation, look for patterns, suggest prosecutorial approaches. That's the kind of thing that these lawyers in the National Security Division do. Remember that the bulk of the work is done by local U.S. attorneys' offices acting on the arrests done by local FBI agents, but it's the overall supervision and guidance from the Justice Department that can help these cases.
Give me the why now piece of this, Pete, right? Because how much of this, you look at the timing, we're a week out, not even from the anniversary of January 6th. How much was the riot last year any kind of contributing factor to kind of shift their focus to make this announcement? Or is that conflating two things that aren't really related? I don't know. Talk me through that.
No, I think you're right. I think it very much was a factor. I think Charlottesville was a factor as well. You know, you put those two things together and you see a different trend. And also, Hallie, some of the most interesting research that came out last week said that the majority of people who were rioting in the Capitol were not followers of violent extremist groups or violent extremists themselves. They were people who decided that they heard this message and they wanted to take action, and they approved of violent action. And that's something that Justice Department is very much concerned about. You saw some of these public opinion polls that said a number of respondents think something like a third of them think that it's okay occasionally to use violence against the government. And you heard Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, push back on that in his comments last Wednesday. So I think it's all those factors put together.
Pete Williams in our Washington newsroom for us. Pete, really quick before you go, there is no federal domestic terrorism statute, right?
Right. But there is a law that allows the government to seek a domestic terrorism enhancement at the time someone is sentenced. And Matthew Olson got some questions today about why the government so far in all these guilty pleas has not sought that enhancement. He didn't take a direct answer to that. He simply said, well, you know, every case is different and we're not done yet, which I guess suggests that at some point the government may seek that domestic terrorism enhancement in some of these cases.
Pete Williams, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You bet.
I want to tell you, that fire in Philadelphia, that horrific fire that killed 12 people last week in Philadelphia, including 8 kids. We now know, according to officials, it was started by a lighter near a Christmas tree. Firefighters said this afternoon that that's what was the cause, but they say they only have the words of a 5-year-old child who says he was the one who did it. They say they've determined he was the only one in the part of the apartment where the fire started. But they point out that the child, who is just one of only 2 people who survived the fire, is traumatized. And his words are certainly not enough to make it the official cause. Just a devastating story in every single way there. Coming up here on the show, things went from bad to worse today for the UK's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Why? Because of his pandemic partying, Bojo. This one, BYOB. The consequences he could be facing as Europe is dealing with a very grim COVID outlook. We're heading overseas after the break. The WHO today says Europe is just weeks away from half its population being infected with Omicron. That projection is based on the 7 million new cases reported across Europe in the first week of 2022 alone. 7 million new cases. We've seen how an uptick in cases sometimes leads to more lockdowns, fewer people gathering, more restrictions. And now there's another layer on top of this, with the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson taking some heat after it was just revealed he apparently hosted another party when the country was locked down back in May of 2020. People are not happy about it. Here's some of what happened in Parliament today.
It's clear that in this country, the same rules apply to everyone.
His absence speaks volumes, as does his smirks on the media. The public have already drawn their own conclusions. He can run, but he can't hide.
Parliament gets rowdy over there, right? This last party reportedly invited more than 100 staff members to Downing Street, right as his government was enforcing measures that kept non-essential businesses closed and loved ones apart. Matt Bradley is on top of this story for this one. Matt, man, you know, not a good look. Not a good look for Boris Johnson, and I feel like that is objectively fair to say as a journalist, right? This is not the first party he's been linked to at a time when people like couldn't, you know, go to other people's funerals, right, because of these lockdowns. Like, this was an intense time in the UK. Talk to me about the reaction where you are on this.
Yeah, I mean, the public reaction has already been swinging, and that's because of we're just hearing over and over again all of these messages on the news. Family members who are telling horrible stories about how their loved ones died alone and dating those stories to late May when this other party, this latest party, happened to happen. And so now we're hearing from the most recent polls that 2/3 of Britons think that Prime Minister Boris Johnson should resign. 2/3 of the country. That's a huge number. And it's 10% more, about 10% more than the last time you and I talked about this back in December during the last revelations about the last parties that we heard. So, you know, this is how it keeps happening. And so it keeps moving in that direction. Public opinion.
How is it possible that we keep hearing about these things? Because I think to like regular people, they go, wait a second, hypocrisy, you know, thy name is Bojo.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big issue. And of course, now he's facing a lot of pressure to impose restrictions again because Omicron and COVID in general is surging here. So his hands are tied politically now because he's painted with this hypocrisy that nobody is going to forget. I mean, as long as his own party is pushing that line, now there are members of his own party seriously talking about Boris Johnson resigning. This sounds like it's just, you know, parents catching a bunch of kids partying when they're out of town. This is very, very serious. The Prime Minister is in very serious legal jeopardy here.
Talk to me about that legal jeopardy, right? Because there is an investigation, the way that I understand it, from the Metropolitan Police that are involved in someone looking into this here. But, I mean, realistically, Matt, right, when we talk about consequences, he's still the Prime Minister, right? So what do those consequences look like?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's already been an independent investigation that was launched by Sue Ryan. She's a top public official, and she's known as a really fierce investigator, but she was appointed to run this investigation by 10 Downing Street, by the Prime Minister's office. So that's why the opposition is saying this looks like it could just be a whitewash by the Prime Minister. And that's what they said today. The Labour Party accusing the Prime Minister of hiding behind this investigation in order to try to get away from the questions, because this is what Parliament was saying today. Like you were hearing, they're saying, look, we just have one simple question, and it just requires one simple answer. Were you at the party or were you not? It doesn't need an investigation. We don't need to have Scotland Yard come out and check on this. We just need to hear from the Prime Minister. And I got to tell you, tomorrow, that's when we're going to hear about it. That's when that famous, if you think this Parliament is raucous, Parliament questions, or Prime Minister's questions, that's what we're going to see tomorrow. And that's when Prime Minister Boris Johnson is really going to have to face the music.
Well, Matt, I hope that you can set up your laptop in your house again, because we may have you back. Thank you. I appreciate you being on top of this story for us. Thank you. Thank you. Coming up here on the show, they say there's no issue more important than voting rights. But some of these advocates skipped President Biden's speech in Atlanta today. We're taking a deeper dive into the backdrop in Georgia, why it's so important, with our Blaine Alexander coming right up. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, an apparent North Korean missile launch might have been the reason why some air traffic controllers out west ordered ground stops. The FAA says the decision was a, quote, matter of precaution. It was pretty quick, only about 7 minutes, but still. Number 2, United Airlines says it's cutting flights because of the Omicron surge. We heard from CEO Scott Kirby, who says about 3,000 employees are currently testing positive for COVID. That's like 4% of United's total workforce in the U.S. Number 3, prosecutors in the Ghislaine Maxwell case say they're willing to dismiss 2 perjury charges against her, but only if her conviction for her role in recruiting and grooming teen girls to be sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein is allowed to stand. They say dismissing the perjury counts would mean victims would not have to testify again and could help bring this whole thing to a close. Number 4, researchers over in the UK have uncovered the skeleton of an extinct prehistoric reptile predator, or in plain English, what they're calling a sea dragon. Oh, here's some new nightmare fodder. It's 33 feet. It's got a skull that weighs a ton. It's the biggest and most complete dinosaur skeleton ever discovered in the UK. Man, Jurassic Park, watch out. Okay, sea dragons weren't exciting enough. Here's number 5. How about driving goldfish? Researchers in Israel have successfully trained several goldfish, oh my word, to operate a robotic vehicle on land. Are you looking at this? They say the experiment's part of an effort to better understand goldfish's cognitive abilities. My God. First the humanoid robots, now the goldfish. Watch out, humans. Back to that deeper dive on voting rights now. President Biden getting some frustration, right, from some people while he was in Georgia to talk about passing those voter protection laws. Not surprisingly from Republicans, but also, perhaps more surprisingly, from members of his own party. We talked about how the president's trip to Georgia is a return to the state that was key to his victory, gave his party the majority in Congress. Georgia matters, right? We talked about some of the notable names that skipped the president's speech in Atlanta, leaders of voting rights groups, some of them, who say they want tangible work on voting rights legislation fast.
We are utterly befuddled that he has not been able to move Senators Manchin or Sinema to get them on board with these very important pieces of legislation. Democracy hangs in the balance.
That's how these advocates feel. This isn't, they don't think they're exaggerating when they say things like democracy hangs in the balance. And here's why. Look at this map. At least 19 states have passed laws making it more difficult to vote in just the last year, right? That's the landscape across the country. You look at the landscape in Georgia. We told you, Georgia matters. Look at the race for governor there. This long-anticipated rematch between Stacey Abrams on the one hand, who, as we mentioned, was not at the president's speech today either, scheduling issue apparently, and then on the other hand, Republican Governor Brian Kemp. There could be a lot at stake for Democrats here, right? I want to bring in Blaine Alexander, who's in Atlanta, reporting on all this. Blaine, it is so good to see you. I'm so glad for you to be on the show tonight. Thank you. Talk to me about the landscape in Georgia, because you had, Stacey Abrams was a huge driving force in sort of the grassroots movement to get people registered. More than 13,000 black voters registered between 2016 and 2020. That's a lot. That was a 25% increase, right? Do the voters that you're talking to think that they are getting what they hoped out of President Biden and his pledges?
Well, Hallie, there are a number of them, a number of organizers as well, who give a very strong, definitive no to that answer. They say, I spoke with one organizer who was very fired up. She said that she absolutely expected voting rights to be passed by now, to be a done deal, to be the law of the land. And as you heard her say, she's befuddled as to the fact that it's not. And so when we spoke to these organizers, remember, these were people that we met back in 2020 because in many ways, they were the people who were pounding the pavement. They were knocking on doors. They were making phone calls. They were sending text messages, getting those people to vote. And in many ways, they were behind that blue wave that we saw sweep across the state. Well, they say now that they're getting ready to gear up for the midterms, they're going to go back to those same voters that turned out in 2020 and say, hey, guess what? It's time to come out and vote again. But she says they're really going to be working in many ways with one hand tied behind their back if they don't give the voters something to show for their efforts. They say they need to be able to hold up something and say that here's the return on your investment if we want them to come back again in 2022. Here's a little bit of what she told me. Take a look.
Our biggest fear is when we go to the doors and we're knocking on those doors and we're showing up again and say, hey, we have nothing to point to. We have nothing to say to these voters as to why they should come out again in the midterms and make their voices heard.
And the other thing that's notable, Hallie, when she told me, she said, listen, you hear all of this Washington talk about the filibuster and Senate rules. She said, a lot of people don't care about that. A lot of people don't understand that, know that all they're hearing are excuses, excuse after excuse. So she says, bottom line, people are looking at her and saying, you know what? He needs to find a way to get it done. Whatever the rules are, whatever the procedural changes need to be, find a way to get it done. Hallie.
And this is, they're talking to the urgency here, right? They're pointing out that he's got to get this done. You look at Georgia, it's such an interesting state, Blaine. I mean, you know it so well. It's been turning bluer and bluer, right? Flipping for President Biden in 2020. When you look at the landscape altogether, when you look at that sort of marquee race between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp, as we talked about, Democrat and Republican, there are so many eyes nationally on the state of Georgia because in some ways what happens there is a bit of a microcosm for what could happen in some of these other key swing states around the country.
Absolutely. In two ways. Number one, when you talk about the law that the Republican-led state legislature passed, we saw a number of other laws similarly passed around the country. But the other thing, of course, about this is that, yes, when you look at the fact that, yes, the state did flip blue for President Biden back in 2020, but it was still a narrow margin. He won by less than 12,000 votes. So when I spoke with Kendra Cotton yesterday, I asked her if the same conditions were true in 2022 as in 2020, but that law were in place, does she think that they would see the same outcome. And she says it's likely that that wouldn't happen. She says she's so concerned about what would happen if this Republican law is now the law of the land without any sort of federal guardrails, as she put it. She's very concerned about what turnout's going to look like and whether or not they'll see the same type of outcome. Remember, this is going to be the first statewide election that we've seen here in Georgia since that law was put into place, Hallie.
Such a good point. Blaine Alexander, I would be remiss to let you go without sharing with our viewers one other piece of exciting news, which is you are back from maternity leave. I know this is your second day back at work, spending some time with sweet baby Sage. We have a picture we're going to show people. Can you get over how gorgeous that baby girl is? Oh, my God. How are you doing, Blaine? I know it's not easy. A lot of us know it's not easy to come back, off leave. You doing all right?
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. Oh my goodness. Pictures from where she is right now from home are helping a lot.
Good.
You were so kind. You reached out to me yesterday, so that helps a lot too. So just all of the love is definitely helping me get through it. And it's been a very busy day with the president here, so I haven't had time to really think about how much I'm missing her. So I'm doing well, Hallie. I appreciate it.
Listen, skedaddle home after nightly. We'll be watching, and I know you want to give that baby a kiss goodnight. Blaine, it's so great to see you. We'll see you again soon, I'm sure. Thanks, son. Coming up here on the show, a lot of people are giving the Pope the side eye tonight. We'll talk about the backlash he's getting from his comments on cancel culture, kids, even pets. Pope, what's up? Plus, unbelievable video. A medical chopper with a baby on board crashed, look at this, on its way to a hospital in Philadelphia. Why emergency officials are calling what happened after an absolute miracle. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Northeast Bureau, a medical helicopter transporting a baby to a Philadelphia hospital crashed today next to the front steps of a church. Look at this, in a really pretty populated neighborhood. Incredibly, neither the infant, nor the nurse, nor the crew members aboard have any kind of life-threatening injuries. That is unbelievable. An emergency official on the scene basically said that, called it an absolute miracle. We still don't know what caused the crash. Our Northeast Bureau also reporting a second Starbucks store in New York State has voted to unionize. The store is just a few miles away from where that first New York Starbucks voted to do the same thing in downtown Buffalo last month. And finally, from our Southeast Bureau, the Georgia Bulldogs have been searching for a title for the last 41 years. And guess what? Last night, they got it. Spoiler alert. I mean, just kidding. If you don't know about this by now, I'm sorry for you. They beat Alabama, their big SEC rival, in the championship game. Fun fact, Crimson Tide's Nick Saban was the longtime mentor of Georgia's head coach Kirby Smart. Smart was an assistant, actually, to him for years before he returned to his alma mater in 2016. Okay, so listen to these proclamations from somebody who I know you know. Number one, people who choose pets over children are selfish. Number two, cancel culture is trying to rewrite history and is one-track thinking. That is coming from the guy you see on the screen, the Pope, Pope Francis, who people have praised as progressive on everything from the environment to being the first to say LGBTQ people have the right to be a family. But in just the last week, he's focused in on today's society. Last week, he criticized couples who chose to have pets instead of kids, saying their decision is a detriment to civilization. Now, in a new speech, he's going after, quote-unquote, cancel culture, even switching to say cancel culture in English during a speech that was actually in Italian. It comes as more and more younger people seem to be moving away from organized religion. Check out these numbers from Pew Research Center, finding people that identify as Christian are at 63%, down from 75% just a decade ago. And people not affiliated with religion at all has climbed to 29%. And guess what? It's millennials leading the way. You know, when we talk millennials, we got to bring in Callan Rosenblatt. She joins me now to talk about this. Callan, this is super interesting, right? Because Pew found that 3 out of 10 people in this country are no longer affiliated with the religion. You have the Pope, who got a lot of praise for his progressive views, but then social media kind of went bananas after these comments on, like, pandemic puppies, on cancel culture, et cetera. How do you see it?
Well, I think first we have to say that the Pope has done a lot to modernize the Catholic Church, hands down. And I think these particular comments on like cancel culture and pandemic puppies are kind of like the outskirt funnier things that he's kind of said, especially because if he wants to connect with millennials, he's helped them make a lot of memes in the last week. So that's been pretty great. But, you know, we see millennials as a generation that is, one, more connected and has had exposure to ideas that their parents may have not have had, or ideas outside of their community. And the other thing is we got to talk about the financial side. Millennials, some of them don't even have a savings account. And how are they going to be able to provide the bare necessities for a child when they can't even provide for themselves in some cases, or are living to paycheck to paycheck? I like to joke that I plan to send my dog to the best dog college that money can buy, but I wouldn't be able to send a child to college right now as a millennial myself. So I think we have to think about all the facets that American millennials are facing when we look at these comments.
As we've talked about, millennials are moving away from religion a little bit, according to these numbers, but there are some churches that are making an effort to try to pull them back in, right? And some of them are getting pretty creative.
Absolutely. We see a ton of churches, faith leaders, rabbis, imams, priests who are joining platforms like TikTok and who are becoming, very accessible to a generation that may have moved away from faith. And I think in a lot of cases, they demystify faith for millennials and even for Gen Z. And they offer a real face to some of these faiths that isn't, the Pope, for example, but you have to be careful because it's a really fine line that a lot of these faith leaders walk, because as soon as you go into like the too earnest or you go into pushing your faith a little too hard, that's when you become a meme. And that's when you kind of do the opposite, where you have a slew of people sort of making fun of you. That clip that we just saw was from a song, I believe it's called He Raised Me Up, or He Picked Me Up, rather. And that song actually kind of went viral just because people thought the song was really good, but then people started mocking it. And so it kind of diverged from being this thing of sharing faith to sort of being a joke. So it's really a tightrope walk that I think faith leaders are having to walk right now.
Callan Rosenblatt, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Coming up, doctors are calling this a breakthrough surgery after they successfully transplanted a pig heart to a human patient for the first time. Our Dr. John explains how big a deal this is. Coming up. So listen to this medical first. A pig's heart now beating inside the body of a 57-year-old human man. That human's name is David Bennett, and his life was on the line. He was not eligible for a heart transplant, like a human-to-human heart transplant. So doctors made this last-ditch effort to try to keep him alive by transplanting a genetically modified pig heart instead. We're going to talk about this. I got to warn you that we're going to show some images of the surgery. Some of them are kind of graphic, so just be warned. Here's the deal. Surgeons at the University of Maryland Medical Center spent 7 hours, this was on Friday, making this transplant, conducting this transplant. The FDA authorized the surgery under what's called compassionate use emergency authorization. That means if a patient has life-threatening conditions, no other options. Well, now doctors are calling this a breakthrough. But here's the thing. It's still early, right? Doctors say there's no guarantee it's going to work long-term, but so far, Bennett is doing well. Dr. John Torres is joining me to talk about this. It is so incredible, John, when you think about this, right? Scientists have been experimenting with this kind of thing for years. Now, here it is. It seems to be working, although, again, it's still early days. Talk us through this.
And you're right, Hallie, it is still early days. We're at day 4 right now, and they're expecting to take him off the heart-lung machine anytime now, today, tomorrow. And once they do that, that's going to be the big step, because right now they know that heart is functioning, and it's functioning well. It's giving him a pulse, it's giving him blood pressure, it's doing the things it needs to do, but he's still being supported by that heart-lung machine. So once they switch to pure heart, that's when we'll have a really huge indicator of what's going on. But by all indications, it should function normally, and they expect it to function for days, weeks, maybe even for the rest of the year. That's the hope behind this. But one of the reasons they're using a pig is because we're familiar with pigs. We use them for other types of transplants. For heart valves, for example, sometimes we use them to graft skin temporarily until we can get other skin we can graft. There are a variety of things we can use, and in this case, the pig gave them one more step towards using that heart. They had to adjust it a little bit to do that, but it's looking so far like it's working very well. And if it does, again, pigs are the kind of animal that can grow very quickly, and so we're able to get these very quickly, which could help towards transplants, because we know there's a huge need right now for organ transplants in humans, and we're not meeting that need and haven't ever.
And there are some real long-term implications for this, right? Like, I mean, this is a big deal for the medical community if, in fact, it ends up being successful.
this is a huge deal for the medical community. One of the things they had to do is genetically alter the pig because they had to make sure that immediate rejection wasn't an issue. And so they used gene altering to do that. And then on top of that, they also had to alter the genes to make sure the heart wouldn't grow because pigs' hearts tend to keep growing, and we can't have that in the human body because ours don't. But beyond that, it's showing that this is possible. And if it's possible, and it does turn out to be this huge breakthrough that we think it will be, then this is going to be the future of things because you can grow pigs very quickly. Pigs are closer to us genetically than we think they are. You're able to manipulate the genes to a certain extent, and this could certainly help because there is that lack of organs right now. And because of that lack of organs, right now, every day 17 people die waiting for an organ. This could certainly cut down on that and make it much more easy for people to get organs and to live with those organ transplants.
It's incredible. I only have a couple seconds left, but I have to ask you this because USA Today is reporting that one of the reasons why Mr. Bennett didn't qualify for a human transplant was because, he hadn't been following all the doctor's orders, he missed some appointments, didn't take some meds, et cetera. How much could that affect how successful this one turns out to be when, as you say, in a matter of days, they could take him off the heart-lung machine and see how that heart itself does?
It's going to be very important that he does this going forward, but he has a team that's watching him very closely right now. And one of the things with a human heart transplant is they have to be able to follow through with the medications, the appointments, those things that are needed to keep them alive. And beforehand, if they don't, then they say, well, you're probably not a great candidate at this point because we can give this heart to somebody who we think will be able to function well with it. And in this case, they said, let's go ahead and try this pig. The patient agreed, and we've gotten this breakthrough surgery, Hallie.
Incredible. Dr. John Torres, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching this hour. We'll be back with you tomorrow, same time, same place.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.